Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Naranjo, and I'm from the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. This is the first of 3 online sessions this spring 2016. These sessions are created to support the Smithsonian Learning Lab workshops, which are taking place in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, with middle school social studies and English language arts teachers. These workshops are funded by the Grable Foundation and in partnership with the Allegheny Intermediate Unit, as well as the Senator John Heinz History Center, which is a Smithsonian affiliate museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This session will be led by 2 of my colleagues here at the Smithsonian from the American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. I think it's fitting that with many states' adoption of the Common Core state standards and their emphasis on informational texts that we start here and begin with the American Art Museum. Elizabeth, Dale-Deines, and Koetsch are going to demonstrate how visual art can be introduced to students as a text through reading of information from an artwork. The session will be interactive, so please feel free to grab a pencil and jot down some notes. We'll also ask you to share your answers with the group using the Q&A app. If it's not enabled on your right side of your screen, you can click the 3x3 grid. It's a grid of 3 squares across and down, and then you should see the option for the Q&A app in blue. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Elizabeth and Peg.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Peg.
And we are going to spend about 40 minutes together, just as Ashley said, looking at artwork from our collection. Our museum's mission is to tell America's stories, and so what we're thinking about is how do you develop historical thinkers with American art? You may be able to see, hopefully, a little picture of our museum pop up in just a second. It's a beautiful space, and it really allows us to tell a lot of stories about American history because we used to be the Patent Office building. We were a seat of inspiration for a lot of different people. We've served as a field hospital during the Civil War. We hosted Abraham Lincoln's 2nd inaugural ball, and now we get to tell so much of American history through beautiful artwork.
So you are going to be taking the role of student. Darren, if we can have the next slide up that talks about the approach, that would be great. Yes, thank you. And as you see, we're going to be asking you to take the role of the student, but you're going to be doing activities that you can immediately use in your classroom. So even though we're going to ask you to take the role of the student, we will be doing the leading that you would take over once you're doing it with your students. And you're going to be experiencing 2 thinking routines. We're going to be detailing them at the end of the session. They're also going to be up in the Learning Lab. So we want you to learn effective practices for integrating the American art into your history classes in a meaningful way. We're going to broaden your understanding of literacy, and it's going to include visual art as an historical source. So one of the tools we're going to be using is called visual thinking strategies. To do this, we're going to ask you to complete a writing exercise. So as Ashley mentioned earlier, please grab paper and pencil, something that you can write down on. It's going to be prompted by looking closely at the artworks in our collection. You're going to learn about our museum resources and professional development opportunities that we'll explain at the end of this, especially for social studies teachers.
So let's look at some artwork. If you'll go ahead 1 slide, please. Thanks so much. So this strategy is, just as Peg said, called Visual Thinking Strategies. We'll give you more details on how to execute the strategy at the end, so don't worry about that right now. Please now just step into the role of student. And the little click, the little link on the bottom right is not a part of the artwork, you might have guessed. It's just a link to where to find more information about visual thinking strategies. But as we do with any VTS-based conversation, I'm going to open the conversation by asking you to look all over the artwork in silence. So please make sure that you're touching every part of the artwork with your eyes. And then I'll start our conversation with a question that's always our starting out point. What's going on in this picture? So if you would please, using that Q&A box, pop into the Q&A box what you think is going on in this picture. And while we're waiting for someone to provide us a little information, what's your first impression, Peg?
I notice how close they are to each other.
Okay.
And I don't mean just physically, but also it seems emotionally.
Okay.
But they seem very comfortable in each other's presence.
Okay. So Peg has noticed that there's a physical proximity which also leads to an emotional intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, gorgeous.
How about you, Elizabeth?
Oh, what do I think is going on in this picture? Well, I think that these are people from a long time ago who are reading a book together.
And notice that we're just asking you to focus on the first things that you see. We're not asking you to interpret, we're just asking you, what do you see? Again, looking at all the details. And back to what I see, Elizabeth, I notice a lot of wrinkles on something that's covering her arm.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not quite echoed in the scarf that's around her, but she seems to be wrapped up a lot.
Mm-hmm. So Peg's noticing some details in the artwork that help tell a larger story. It looks like Kate and I are in agreement. There's a reading lesson, but she's added a layer. It looks like she says it's a lesson between a grandparent and a child. Linda has added that they're related and fond of each other. And son, so this is coming up a lot. And then also Nicole, I think it is, has mentioned that this boy is pointing to a specific portion of the book. So if I was in a classroom with you right now, I'd be pointing to all of these different things that you all are noticing, and I'm going to ask that we go back to that idea of a grandmother-grandson relationship, or the assertion that these people are related to one another. And I'm going to challenge you. What do you see that makes you say that? Would you please type into the chat box some visual evidence that supports the assertion of what's going on in this picture?
Now, I kind of started that a little bit, Elizabeth, when I mentioned about wrinkles on around and something wrapped around her arm and wrapped around, her neck. And that's what we're looking for, is something that leads you to the conclusions, or what you've already stated is what you see.
So we've got this grandmother-grandson relationship. Often when I share this artwork with students in the gallery, they note the facial features as being at least rhyming, if not exactly the same. And so there's definitely a familial resemblance there. People notice that. People also might notice, in addition to the sort of wrinkles on the arm as an indicator of the woman's age, many people notice how fresh and pink the cheeks are for the boy. So that's, the artist is definitely emphasizing a difference in age there. Kate's added the older woman has her hand around the child, which shows the familiarity. And then also building on what Peg had mentioned before, the idea of their physical proximity. Now Kate's adding a layer and Paul is as well, that they're leaning into one another. So there's almost a trust and a dependence there. Linda's adding the calm and relaxed face. And then again, really that important element of her hand around his body and their closeness together. Amy has added, building on what Peg had mentioned about all of these scarves and whatnot covering her. She's a very covered up individual, but the arm around the child is showing tenderness. So yeah, there's a lot there.
And Linda's adding about their faces appearing to be calm and relaxed. And again, think about having somebody's arm around you. You can use that as a symbol to push somebody away, or indicate that the person you're next to wants to get away. But you're
rather
also,
if you're like this, that leaning in.
So far, everyone seems to be reading this as the fact that he's happy to be there. He's glad to be in her company.
So my next question using VTS would be, what more can we find? So thinking more about the additional stories that we might be able to tell about this artwork. What's going on in this picture? What more can we find? So what do you think, Peg? What more can we find?
I'm looking at how fancy his vest is.
It is a fancy vest.
There's obviously somebody who's paid a lot of attention to this boy and the way he looks. I mean, no matter what time period this piece is from, there's no way you'd get me in a vest like that.
Fair enough. So this very fancy vest definitely is telling us something. What do you think it's telling us, aside from maybe it's uncomfortable?
Not necessarily uncomfortable, but this is a very special occasion.
Okay.
And so I'm thinking, okay, first of all, who can afford to have a painting done?
Okay.
And second of all, to be asked to pose and think, well, how do I want posterity to remember me?
So Doran, it looks like, is adding on the same idea that you've introduced, Peg, the idea that this clothing is elaborate. And the way that Doran has phrased this edition, it's the boys' clothing is much more elaborate. So it seems like there's some change that's happened between these generations. Linda's added, I want to know who they are, when they lived, and how they're related to one another. And then you were also layering in some ideas about their status or their affluence, as is indicated by all of these details in the artwork. So we could go quite a lot longer with this same artwork and using this same strategy, but what I'll ask us to do now is to, Darren, if you will, add a little bit more information. So on the next slide, just back one, there we go. You'll notice the tombstone information has been added. So you'll notice that the title of this artwork is Mrs. James Smith and Grandson, so you guys are incredible detectives. It was painted in 1776 by a man named Charles Wilson Peale. So I'll ask you to apply your new knowledge. So now that you know the title of this artwork, now that you know the time that it was painted, would you please tell me, how does that change your understanding of the artwork?
If at all.
If at all. Did it change your understanding?
No, I think it confirmed.
Yes.
But I like the way Linda, the last questions that you were reading. What you're doing is, as a group, we're hoping will also be encouragement to your students to first use those identification to then generate questions. We hope it develops curiosity. We hope that they would want to find out more about it, and then it's a matter of leading them to the resources that would give them that information. And we're going to cover that later on.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is so interesting when we use VTS, you'll notice that I didn't provide that information, that tombstone information before. We saved that back. And often that's very, very frustrating for teachers, and sometimes it's very, very frustrating for students as well. So we might ask, why in the world didn't we do that? Didn't we provide that information before? And just as Peg was saying, we're endeavoring to get students to make sense of what they're looking at for themselves and to become increasingly curious about it. If I had told you from the start, here's a picture of a lady and her grandson, then that's the only track we'd follow, I imagine. So hey, keeping that information back can be really a powerful thing. So I know for myself, when I look at this information and I think of the significance of the date of 1776, that definitely makes me wonder about these, people who are living in a very pivotal time in our American history. So I'm going to use that as a jumping off point for a next set of guided looking questions. This time, instead of following VTS strictly, we're making a little deviation. But we're going to this time be looking for some symbolism, because this artwork, when we start to think about the date, when we start to think about that relationship that we've begun to explore, we can find and dig a little bit deeper. So instead of looking at these people strictly as grandmother and grandson, I'd like to ask you to think of them as symbols of old and young. How has the artist reinforced those things? We've mentioned before there's the wrapped up arms and the pink cheeks, so that would be a layer of old and young symbolism. Can you all find additional indicators of old and young, or additional levels of symbolism there? Peg, I turn to you.
Oh, I'm afraid of saying anything more. I think we've worn them up. I think we're going to wait.
We're pressing you guys.
What you have to say. I do want to add to what Elizabeth's point was about not showing what we call the tombstone information first, because we also want students to realize that no matter what their prior experiences are with art, they have knowledge that they can apply, that they can immediately start to use as detectives, just like you did. You started exploring it, you started taking those pieces apart that you see there, just like a puzzle, and it gives validation to the fact that you've got some kind of prior knowledge that you can build on.
So Amy has added an idea of the old teaching the young, or the young teaching the old, so this exchange of information. And I love that idea. Let's hang on to that, because that's going to be very, very important when we continue to look for symbolism. I'm going to press you to look one more time, to look carefully at the details that the artist has so deliberately rendered. Can you find one more kind of opposition or detail that illustrates the difference between old and young? Kate has added the flowers on the vest, this elaborate vest that we mentioned before, indicating either youth or springtime, for sure. And let's see, indicators of the older subject include the aged face, not a lot of hair shown, so certainly the head is covered, which indicates a traditional period of time. Definitely. Students also mentioned the difference in the color palette when we compare the bright blue of the boy's coat to the darker sort of chocolatey brown color on the left side. They noticed that difference as well. So that's one layer of symbolism. Let's keep going a little bit deeper, and this time let's look for the ideas of past and future, especially when we're thinking about that date, 1776. What is the significance of past and future for 1776? And Doran's just added the idea of she sits and he stands, so that the little boy being more active, perhaps, the woman being more passive, or at least sedentary. So additional levels of looking. Where do you see past and future?
And also American Revolution.
Oh, and thank you, Peg. I forgot that part. 17 to 76. We can't forget that date. And this, my friends, is wait time, which oddly enough is an important part of using artwork as a text in your classroom. When we're here doing a webinar, to me it feels a little bit uncomfortable, because it's like, it's the technology gone a little wacky? But in real life, giving students an opportunity to really pay attention to all of the parts of the artwork, to make sense of this new kind of visual language that they may not have exercised before, to formulate the answer to the question that we've asked, and then to articulate it. We know as teachers that this is a long thinking process, but definitely giving your students wait time when looking at an artwork is absolutely essential. Linda's added, signs of the revolutionary times are in the style of the boy's coat, the brass buttons and ruffled cuffs, for sure. So we think about style as an indicator. Yep. Paul thinks that there might be a sense of optimism, for sure. And then I will add, I don't remember the name of the person who submitted this great idea, but the idea of old teaching young and young teaching old. Many times people look at the way that the hands are arranged in the bottom part of the composition, and it looks a bit like this woman is handing this book off to her grandson. Somebody also mentioned the boy seems to be pointing to a particular part of the artwork, and I want to make sure that we talk about that. Kate says maybe they're reading a revolutionary pamphlet, and definitely that would be a clincher. We'd know what their sentiment is. What are we missing here? Past and future, the clothing style, light and dark, dark to light. Also the idea Marilyn's added, the grandmother could be passing along traditional stories of British origins. The book could represent passing on of old or original ideas to be further developed in future. So yeah, there's all of this question now about the book. What is this book representing? And if we were able to get very close, or if you wanted to use our Learning Lab unit, you would be able to click on the detail, and it's Hamlet's soliloquy has been very carefully painted onto the page of the book, and that, of course, is where we get that very famous phrase, to be or not to be. So I'm going to pass this off to Peg.
Which goes on to the whole idea of the identity of who they are, to be or not to be, as well as not only the humans but also the country during that time. So Darren, if we can now go to the next slide, which will include, thank you. Some lenses. We're calling these lenses because we'd like you to choose one. We'd like you to look at this painting now through the eyes of somebody who's focused on economics, or history, or culture, or identity. And you'll notice that in that list to the right there are a series of questions. We'd like you to choose one of those lenses and study the questions that are with that lens.
Okay.
Just give you a minute to do that.
So if I chose the cultural lens, I'd be looking at this Mrs. James Smith and grandson with the question in mind: what beliefs, values, behaviors, etc., blah, blah, blah. Did I get it?
You got it.
Okay.
Yep. So, Darren, if you can click it one more time, there should be, thank you, information appearing there. We'd like to give you time to do some independent work. We want you to, again, pick one of those lenses. We'd like to make a claim in response to one of the questions or a series of the questions that are in that lens. And when we say make a claim, again, use the painting as the basis. What do you see in the painting that helps you make a claim in response to that question? You'll notice on the bottom there on the left we're talking about making a claim. The step 2 is to identify support for your claim. What visual evidence do you see that helps you make that claim in response to that question? Third step is to pose a question related to your claim. So it could be a challenge, it could be something left hanging. So first you're using research based on what you see in the painting. Then you're going to state that visual evidence, and then you're going to pose a question building on what you have found. We'd like you to write down your question, not yet in the question box. Just make a note of that on a piece of paper, because you're going to use it as a prompt for research in a few minutes. And while you're working, we're going to play some period music. You don't want to hear us sing.
No.
So as you're starting to write, I just want to let you know that this is called Claim Support Question, and this is a thinking routine that was developed by Harvard's Project Zero team. So we're going to give you a few minutes to do that while we play the music. All right, thanks, Darren. Thank you. We hope by now you've had a chance to write down your claim, the visual evidence that you have seen in the painting to help support that claim, and then already have written a question. And Elizabeth, we have in the question box that it's just a reiteration of finding an answer to your own question and the original question. But right now, we just want you to focus on this: the research you're doing, the claim that you're making, the evidence that you found, and the question that you have hanging. Now you're going to build on that. I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth.
So we are going to try an experiment. The thing to emphasize right now to you all is please do not leave the Hangout. Please keep us up. We are going to challenge you to dig around a little bit in a website that's called American Experience in the Classroom. This is a website that is in development through the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And Darren's going to walk you through visually how to get there. Again, please do not leave the Hangout. Open a new tab, and in that new tab, you're going to put in americanexperience.si.edu. You're going to navigate over to Explore History and Art. And then you'll go down to this first era, the colonization, revolution, and the new nation, and click there. And then you'll see some beautiful artworks all from this time period. You'll scroll down to the We the People link, and you'll click there. And here you'll find our new friend, Mrs. James Smith and grandson, as well as some information that has been fully researched by some folks here at American Art. Click around a little bit, and what you're doing is you're going to be very quickly trying to find some answers to that question that you posed for yourself. So you made a claim about the artwork. For instance, you claimed that this artwork was an exemplar of, you know, Protestant values during the American colonial period. You cited from the artwork the fact that this woman is very covered up, you know, that she's very reserved in her demeanor, it seems. And your question is, what were the beliefs of Mrs. James Smith and her family? And so I would be looking in this website for answers to that question, or if I couldn't find specifics about Mrs. James Smith and her particular family, where were they living? What was the predominant belief system in that particular area? So click around a little bit, again, not leaving the Hangout. And once you've found some information, some additional flavor that you can layer into your understanding of this artwork, you can start to document your thinking and your exploration in that Q&A box. So if you would please do that work, and then in summation write your claim, your support, your question, and then any additional background information that you found to answer that question.
So again, we're going to give you time to do this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Should we play the music again?
I don't know. That was a lot of five. While you're clicking around and while you're exploring the information there, we're going to buzz a little bit in your ear. This is primarily for those folks who are watching the archived version, and it will also be an opportunity for you all to hear a little bit more about resources available to you. So just hear our voices in the back of your head, but continue your research if you're with us live. For those of you who are watching the archived version, we just wanted to give you a little brief overview of the resources that we have available to you. So Darren, if you'll click ahead one, please. American Experience in the Classroom is the website that you're exploring now. That's on the top left of this slide. We also wanted to emphasize that we've put all of this material into a Learning Lab unit. I'm sure I'm using the wrong term for describing the block that we made for you all, but it does contain links to our website, to American Experience in the Classroom. It's got a page for the Mrs. James Smith and grandson artwork and a bunch of call-out boxes, so you can learn a little bit more about various details in the artwork, and sort of a starting point for a looking quiz and some essay response prompts. So that's all in there for you. We've included also links to the Visual Thinking Strategies webpage as well as Harvard Project Zero, because there are a lot of great strategies that we find, I think, particularly useful on a day-to-day basis when we're using artwork as a
very easy to adapt, just like the visual thinking strategies.
And then I'm going to let Peg tell you a little bit about this weird screen that you see in the bottom.
And then Elizabeth is passing it on to me because I have the pleasure of developing video conferences for students in schools around the country. We have a team of presenters who work on 10 different topics. And again, if you go to the website that you see listed below there, americanart.si.edu, and click on Education Resource, Classroom Video Conferences, you'll see an area called Artful Connections. And these are all, believe it or not, free. And we give them to 3rd grade on up through 12th grade, and they're on 10 different topics. All you have to do is go to the instructions where they say to schedule it with an organization called CILC. Tell us the date and the time you would prefer to have one of those topics. We do like to have a couple of weeks' notice because we do get requests a lot, and we want to make sure we can have presenters to fulfill your request. So go look at those topics, sign on to CILC, tell us which ones you prefer, and we'll be in touch with you to schedule that.
Yep.
Again, free.
And in addition to free, they're entirely interactive, open-ended question, discussion-based exchange. So your students will not be sitting and watching a lecture provided by our docents, but rather engaged in a conversation like the one that we're modeling together
right now.
today.
Yep.
Yeah. So we're starting to get responses from folks, so that is fabulous. I'm going to read these responses aloud, not to discourage anybody from providing their additional feedback, but rather, as I read these responses aloud, I'd like to ask you to think about any trends that you notice. So when you start to think about those lenses, which in summation were economic, historical, cultural, and identity related, you know, how is this artwork pulling on a bunch of different threads? What does this artwork tell us about the American story? So Kate said that her assertion was that these were supporters of independence based on the fact that they looked like they were from the merchant class and would benefit from independence. She wanted, however, to see to see a little bit more about what they were reading as a way to better gauge, if that is an accurate assertion. The website, she noticed, says that they are reading to be or not to be, which alludes to an uncertain future. So that's interesting. Sometimes we might not be able to straight away answer our own question, but I hope that you're encouraged to dig around a little bit more. Linda chose the economic lens, excuse me, and she claimed that these are subjects from an affluent family. She supported her claim by looking at their dress and the fact that they're educated and able to read. So for a lot of students, that's an overlooked point that you might be able to make with them by using this artwork. Let's see. And then her question related to, after her looking, was if they are related to any famous Smiths from the Revolutionary period. Campbell Smith, while not entirely famous, he was certainly a scoundrel. So the grandson that you see on the right side was sort of known to be not shady, but a colorful sort of person. Any additional claims, supports, and questions are welcome. Please do pop them in. And how about you? I'm going to put you on the spot, Peg. What claim would you like to make?
Well, I think I tend towards the cultural, beliefs, values, and behaviors, traditions, and ways of life, and think, especially with the representation of the grandson, that change is coming, but we don't quite know what it is.
Yes.
And it's exactly the same it is today.
Yeah.
We always talk in education about the jobs that the students will have once they graduate. We can't even imagine what some of them will have the opportunities to do or be educated for.
Sure.
So we give a lot of credits to teachers for what you're preparing them for.
Yeah, for sure. Nicole has added, this is a family that values education and learning. This is supported by the grandmother and grandson reading together, the centrality of the book. So when we think about composition, an artist is going to call our attention to very important elements, things that are intended to help build a bigger meaning or a larger idea. And we can see that all of these fingers are pointing to this book. So while we as humans are drawn to the gaze first, our eye is then drawn also to what they're all focused on, at least physically. So that's a really interesting point. And the fact that it's put in between the two of them highlights its significance. Linda's adding that she found more information that addresses her question, and that they are related to William Smith from the Continental Congress. So these people have this larger family system that they work within.
And Elizabeth, as we're waiting to see if a few more people respond, I want to point out that in artwork, sometimes it's not obvious one way or the other. Think about all the options an artist has for what moment they're going to capture.
Yes.
And perhaps in that moment, they want to be able to give you a number of options and a number of choices. Think if you're looking at this painting right after it was painted. If you are the grandson and the grandmother looking at it and thinking about how you're depicted, and then how we interpret it now, how many years later?
So different.
And what we now know based on history and what has taken place.
Yes.
So there's no way they could have predicted what people would have interpreted it as 230 years or 40 years later.
Sure.
And yet an artist at that moment in time has to make decisions, and at the same time know they're being paid by these people to paint this portrait.
Yes.
It may not be a point that your students might not think to bring up,
Right.
but they not only can afford it, they can also pay for it,
Sure.
and maybe have some say
Mm-hmm.
in how they're going to be represented.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain decisions made that are clearly giving you certain kinds of information, and then others that are left to be interpreted in a number of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things for all of you that are considering using artwork as a primary or secondary source document is, just as Peg has said, emphasizing to students that it started out as a blank canvas is a really important way to get started, because a lot of times students might not think about the creative process, and all of those choices that Peg emphasized are so important. We've got Amy adding a cultural claim. Education was important during this time. Her support is the focus of the painting being grandmother and grandson reading together, and the question being, did all young children have the same access to education? I believe, says Thomas, that the bright light, around the young man shows the thoughts and hopes for the future and the hope of a new country, which of course is so interesting when we start to think about the fact that this is painted in the year that the Declaration of Independence is issued, but at the same time we don't know what the outcome of the Revolutionary War is. So that idea of it being hope for the future rather than what we know now eventually became a certainty is a really important point. Thank you for making that. So for those of you who are thinking together and sharing all of this feedback, I'd love to move forward to the reflection slide. And this is just to kind of give a next step for you if you decided to use a claim support question like this one, to think about how all of these various parts impact one another. So it's too easy to talk about an artwork as only being a document of culture or only as a document of the economic status of the sitters. But when we start to think about all of these pieces overlapping, what did you notice in all of these responses from teachers?
Well, I think that they are already starting to combine these threads, you know, and realizing that they're learning a lot more about history by thinking about the fact that we're looking at just one slice of the culture from a particular economic strata, and that they have identities that they've already defined very clearly and know that they can pay for that identity.
Yes.
So that brings that whole economics in there again.
Yes.
Does
and
anybody
identity,
Does anybody see any way of kind of pulling all these threads together, some statement that you would hope your students would create as a result of looking at it from all these different lenses?
I'm noticing now, it's Kate, I think, has shared that Campbell is 8 years old in the painting. So when we start to think about all of these lenses for this boy, what an incredible thing to be growing up in this time where his culture is shifting basically under his feet. His national identity goes from being British to American in his lifetime without having moved outside of, you know, a particular geographic region. You know, his place in the economy, given his racial background, given his family status, is, we might see it as assured these days, but at the time, I wonder for him, what was that experience for him as a person?
As Elizabeth is saying, usually when we're looking at a work, especially in historical work, it's so hard for students, as you probably have found out, to think what life was like before cell phones, before we had the radio, before we had, you know, TV. And when you start stripping all that away and realizing, how did people communicate with each other?
Right.
And how did longevity take place? What were ways of being able to pass information on?
Yeah.
And those changes.
Yeah. So there's a lot here, I think, that we could unpack together. Issues of you know, this question isn't specific to this artwork, of course. It's
exactly.
It's about how is how do we make sense of the world, either looking at it today or looking at historical documents, artworks as historical documents. But I think a lot of the themes really are that it's impossible once we really think about it to take those lenses apart. They really always overlay one another.
Right. But now we hope that you understand the value of taking them apart and asking you to focus on one and then adding your information to all the others.
For sure. So we'd love to be available for question and answer time. If there's anything that we can give you more detail on, we're happy to do so. As far as pulling out more explicitly the mechanics of those looking and thinking strategies, we'll plan to do that together at the end. So this time could be less about mechanics and more about anything that we might be able to do to help you or clarify, as I've said.
I had a question for the two of you. I'm just wondering, so we've been using our student hats, but are there any tips that you have for kind of facilitating for the first time, choosing an artwork that might work best? Are there elements we should be thinking about? Does this work for every artwork?
No.
Well, the visual thinking strategies, I think, does work for every artwork, because keep in mind, you're asking them what they see first, and then to dig deeper and find evidence that supports what they see. Now, coming up with a question that you then want them to do further research on, then I would definitely select an image that, if you do go forward and use our American Experience website, that you know is in there and that has more substantial information to support it, because not every artwork has been as well researched as the ones that are available on that website.
I say no, not every artwork works. I would say, as my practice has worn on, I've become more comfortable with artworks that I didn't think would work before. I think we as human beings love to look at people, and we can create such relationships with artworks that have people in them, that having an artwork with a figure that's identifiable as a figure and has an emotion that is, legible to a novelist looker is a really good place to start, which is why Mrs. James Smith and Grandson is such a profoundly useful artwork for us. It's amazing also to be able to have a couple of bits of information in your back pocket, because I have found when I ask a question that's so open-ended as what's going on in this picture, that if I feel like, I don't know what could be going on in this picture, and I'm just presenting the artwork to my students, I start to rush and be nervous because nobody's answering the question, so I want to start filling that silence. But instead, kind of, number one, wait time, and then number two, being comfortable giving a little prompt here and there if you feel like it's really important to get the conversation rolling. Breaking with VTS, because in VTS you only ask those 1, 2, 3 questions, but I'm no purist with that. But having some information in your back pocket definitely is a useful thing, which is why that American Experience website is such a good one.
And back to Elizabeth's point about using portraits or people, I would not suggest doing this method with your students first with abstract expressionism, for example, because the emphasis there is so much on color and the process by which it was made as opposed to the subject. And then that usually takes a lot more unpacking to be able to analyze those. Elizabeth, we have a comment here.
Would you recommend some portraits that examine life at that time from different perspectives, different regions, men or women, different religions, different classes?
Well, similar to what they saw on the American Experience website.
There's Mrs. George Watson is this woman wearing a beautiful red dress. She's holding a piece of china, and inside that piece of china is a tulip. This is very important because the china and the tulip bulb are both imported. This red dress is luxurious. It's, got lace. Every single part of that artwork is designed to show the insider that this woman has money and connections to the world abroad. So that's a really important one. Mr. Robert Hooper is a gentleman of rather substance, shall we say, and a modern day kids will look at it and say, man, he is really obese, he looks very unhealthy, but this big tummy to people in his world said, I have money enough to eat very rich foods, even in the colonies. So that's a really fascinating one to play with as well. So those kinds of portraits, especially for early America, are really essential. Easy go-to pieces.
And then, if you want to, bring it up to today in selfies.
Yes.
I love asking the students, now that they've learned about what history will think of them, how do they want to picture themselves?
Yes. That's a really fascinating one. Amy's got is supporting Stephanie's question that it's hard to find appropriate sources for world history. You know, it's really that is a challenge I have not been confronted with. Of course, our collection is focused so much on American history and very familiar visual vocabulary. The one exception to that, I'd say, is the Adams Memorial, which is in memory of Clover Adams, who ended her life through a variety of different, or because of a variety of different pressures. And her husband chose to honor her memory with an artwork that is a cloaked figure. This is in Rock Creek Cemetery in D.C. Eleanor Roosevelt used to go and sit by this memorial, but it's this figure that's cloaked. It's genderless. It's this beautiful still face, and I bring it up because it was inspired by Buddhism in the early 1900s, and so it's this very, you can understand the mood of the artwork, but maybe not necessarily immediately grasp its meaning because it's visually a little less familiar. And I would say that starting with the mood, starting with emotion, especially for middle and high school students for whom emotion is such an important connector, is a totally worthwhile place to start. And then talking a little bit more about the historical context, sort of building out from that, might be a way to go.
One thing we haven't mentioned is that you can also go to our website, americanart.si.edu, and you'll see a link for search collections, and you can go down and put keywords in and see what artworks come up. We have over 40,000 artworks that are digitized in that collection.
Make sure you click the little button that says that artworks with image, because otherwise you'll get returned a lot of things that don't have a picture for you. Thank you, Linda, for your support of the idea of analyzing a painting through different lenses. I think it does support student choice, and it really does push analysis for sure. Thomas asks a question about using the same strategies with photos. For example, Alexander Gardner's Antietam and Gettysburg photos. Peg has done that extensively, actually.
Right, and we've got a number of photos not only taken by Gardner, but also by photographers that he hired and that he had as part of his suite of photographers. And one strong part in our collection is the fact that the Civil War was the first time that photographers were embedded with the troops. So you're going to find a lot of examples in there, and also research that shows whether some of the photos were, let's say, arranged as opposed to the actual realistic image, bodies or such that were found on the fields. And I won't go into that in detail here, but we do have some of those.
And that's a really powerful approach, I think, to very specifically answer your question, Thomas. Claim support question might not be the immediate looking strategy. I would say open it up with what's going on in this picture, that sort of thing, and then build to claim support questions. So stacking strategies with photographs is I think, an important thing. And then, encouraging students to really think about that photography has never been an exact capturing of reality. More often than not, at least in my experience, they'll look at a photograph that is an old photograph and assume that that's what things looked like. So really, what's going on in this picture, a wide open strategy, and then introducing that idea that maybe the photographer has made some choices that color our understanding of the artwork, and then a claim support question or something like that might be a way to build toward that. All right, so I want to be respectful of your time. We did want to give you an idea of how we might bump this up to the present day.
So what we want to do is go to the next. Oh, so thank you. You've already gotten there, Darren. And the strategies, again, to review, we've mentioned visual thinking strategies and the claim support question. And in answer to those questions about what else does it apply to, think of the new piece that we've just shown here. Again, we are giving you the tombstone information, and there are words written in it. But how might you have your students apply the strategies that we've asked you to use? If you're looking at this new artwork, which strategy might you use, and in which order? What would you want your students to get out of the new piece that's called Sob Sob? Do we have time for them to write in the question box? Great.
Ooh, Ashley says yes. I love it.
Yes.
I love putting two artworks side by side because it just begs comparison. And for those of you who are using artwork in the classroom for the first time, this kind of side by side pairing is a really powerful one. You know, I immediately noticed that both of these artworks have to do with books, which I know means that there's something about knowledge being power or powerful in both of these artworks. But of course, also I noticed that these are starkly different, you know, figures. There's one pair, and now there's a single person. In one, we talked about positioning being so important. The grandmother is seated, the boy is standing, but this new figure, she seems to be somehow toppled to the floor, and what does that mean? And then I noticed there's this thought bubble that actually says Sob Sob, so, you know, I have all these questions. I want to know more.
Kate says she recognizes the artist, Kerry James Marshall, and she thinks there are great possibilities for teaching American history with these.
Awesome.
In fact, we just had a group of 8th graders here today who noticed, for example, that she is in a position similar to what was Andrew Wyeth's painting called Christina's World. And the difference between Christina reaching out, looking towards a home with her back towards you versus the young lady here in Sob Sob turning around and facing you, and what direction is her gaze looking in? And they also noticed that her body was half on wood floor and half on either tile or carpet. So they were wondering if she is in a balance right now between her history. And though it may not be so clear on the screen that you're looking at, but all the books on the shelves and the book in front of her lap have to do with African history or African American history. And so they were wondering what support she had to be able to move forward. And thus, is she moving forward? So it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how many clues does an artist give you and how much is left for a question mark for you to respond to based on your prior knowledge and experience. Tom said, I've never done this with artwork, but I have used this with political cartoons. It works really well. And the kids love linking the past with the present.
Nice.
And as you know, political cartoons have spanned a wide range of years. You know, and if your papers are anything like ours, on Saturday they do what they think are the best political cartoons from around the country. And that are so timely. Look at.
That's a great one. Linda mentions I might have students launch into a claim support question strategy because I think it's contemporary feel. They may be able to get into this right away and discuss details afterwards. So that's a really interesting idea, that by selecting a contemporary artwork, something that feels very present for students, they might be more comfortable diving into the bigger thinking and then kind of zooming in and out rather than zooming just out. That's awesome. Thank you for that. So we want to make sure that we give a little plug to our teaching institutes, which is on the next slide. These are being held in July for a week long. They're 2-week-long sessions. You come and you basically own the Smithsonian American Art Museum for that time. The focus is on how to use artwork in your humanities classroom, and we do all kinds of great stuff, which really does focus on equipping you, but then giving you ideas that you could use, you know, in September, building a unit that kind of links already with things that you're doing. We don't want you to reinvent yourself or reinvent the wheel. Just how can you start to incorporate art into your practice? So that's the Teaching Institute. Feel free to shoot us an email if you have a question about it. And I think Ashley's got additional things for you.
I sure do. Looking ahead, there's actually, I think, 2 more slides that might be a debrief. We'll just double check.
Yeah, we can cover that afterward to give you time that you need.
Sure. So we'll kind of jump ahead. Thank you so much to our presenters, Elizabeth and Peg. They've really helped me, at least, think of artworks as informational texts rich with all sorts of things and not just thinking of them as illustrations that go along with the words. So thank you for that. I also wanted to let you know that you can access the archive on the Google Plus page as well as the Smithsonian Education YouTube channel. And it will also be added to the Learning Lab collection that Elizabeth has created so that you'll have all of the resources right there in one place. We hope you'll continue to join us for the other 2 sessions in the series for social studies educators. The next session will be with a geographer from the National Air and Space Museum, exploring our planet through satellite images. And he'll be looking at data, maps, satellite images, and thinking about global trends. And that'll be taking place on March 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And then we also have a 3rd Google Hangout, which is Understanding Ancient Civilizations Through Artifacts. And that will be with the Freer Sackler Gallery of Art. We'll have an educator as well as a curator's perspective on that topic. So feel free to join us for that as well. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Peg and Elizabeth to kind of do the final thoughts, last-minute thoughts on debriefing both of the strategies that they've introduced today.
So we'd love to go to the next image. I believe
it might actually be back.
Darren might need to go back.
There it is.
Thank you. So just a quick review. We asked you 3 core questions with the visual thinking strategies. I'm not going to repeat those. I just want to have you look at number 2 because the question was raised by Ashley as to putting on your teacher cap. What is the role that you play? And notice that we first listened. We helped point out whatever were the responses and feedback that we were getting. We paraphrased what the students were thinking of, sometimes bringing it up to another level so that they could see all the different threads they were thinking about and making those links. And this is a way that we know, again, their prior knowledge and how we can help build on that.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth?
Yeah. The claim support question, again, we just wanted to kind of blow that up so that you have all of the information that you might need. The approach is to share the artwork. I would say doing some sort of a warm-up conversation just so that students can make sense of what they're looking at. And then asking them to make a claim about a topic. So you prescribe the topic, asking an essential question or something really meaty as the initial warming up looking question kind of sets the stage for that claim. Then you challenge students to make sure that they can support that claim with visual evidence from the artwork, and then you ask them to pose a question related to that claim. And then as you can see on the right side, we've got some definitions there, just as though you're having a conversation or a debate. You want to make sure that everybody understands what you mean by claim, support, and question. We all were able to do that pretty readily because of our I think, shared age or grade level, but students might need to have that clarified just so that they know what a claim is as opposed to trying to answer an essential question that you've already asked earlier in the discussion. So that's that. We look forward to any emails that you might like to send us. We're available to you as resources, so please do communicate with us.
And certainly if you want to take advantage of any of those resources that we talked about, whether it's the video conferencing or whether it's the summer institutes, just let us know.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And finally, I just wanted to thank the sponsors once again. So the Grable Foundation, Allegheny Intermediate Unit, the Senator John Heinz History Center, and of course our presenters from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Look forward to seeing you at the next Google Hangout. Thanks so much, everyone.